Small boy sits in a room surrounded by his pets. A scarred army man enters the room with a handkerchief on display. The boy learns that this handkerchief belonged to his deceased father, a war hero who was captured and held prisoner by the enemy. The boy's father was continually beaten, tortured, and interrogated by his captors, but to his immense credit, he stayed silent, even to the point of his body being broken and his mind barely functioning. This man had the willpower to elevate what mattered in his life despite being trapped in this tiny, bloody cell. He had taken the same handkerchief that the boy is looking at now and protected it to the limits of his ability. Embroidered in the corner was a date, the 20th of September, 1847. This is the date where the memories of his family lie, the same day that the boy was born. With this in his possession, even given his conditions, he persevered and saw that protecting his family and handkerchief was lockstep with protecting his country. It supported his heart through the miserable conditions, pushing him to survive just a little longer through every miserable day. Even when he was at his lowest, curled up in the corner of the cell, knowing that another day of unspeakable harms were ahead of him, he knew that he needed to keep this handkerchief safe, and in turn, he hid it in his now useless eye socket. The man tells the boy this story and says that this was an act of patriotism, and in fact, all acts of patriotism are the most beautiful virtues in the world. This pride in one's country is the ultimate expression of love. It is just as intense and powerful as the deep and natural love that one has for their family. Many years later, with this philosophy of love and patriotism on his mind, he hovers over a dinner table. He looks at the napkins all lined up next to the plates and silverware and asks which napkin table manners says to take when seated. When told that the left is the proper one to take, he directly opposes this and says that society's manners are wrong. The ones who determine what happens with the napkins on the table, much like anyone does with greater acts in society, are those who take the first napkin, right or left. Manners do not push one to take a specific napkin. People take a napkin because they aren't left with another option. They all follow the leader. If the left is not available, you take the right, and if the right is not available, you take the left. The leaders are the first to make these moves. They are the ones that push everyone to abide by their decision. There are only a few in this world who are worthy of taking the napkin, the ones who can shoulder the responsibility and burden of making those decisions that push the masses into a new choice to follow. In showing this ultimate expression of love for his country, he then proudly declares that it will be him, Funny Valentine, the President of the United States, who will be the one sitting at the table, taking the first napkin. 同じ世界 A few years ago, I watched part 1 of the JoJo's anime, Phantom Blood, for the first time. I had no idea what was in store for me, and I didn't know how weird or even how bizarre the series would get, even if the title should have clued me in. But when I finished it, I sat there with a, that's what all the hype's about? I've heard that JoJo's is praised not only as a classic series, but also as a modern masterpiece. Where was this series that I've been promised? But despite those feelings, I kept watching. I finished part 2, Battle Tendency, and while I liked it more than I liked part 1, it was really only marginally better. I kept reading comments online that people tended to skip parts 1 and 2, so I persevered. As I made my way through parts 3, 4, 5, and 6, I had things that I really liked in each part. In fact, parts 4 and 6 still stand as some of my favorite parts in all of JoJo. But I couldn't really feel why this series was as revered as I've seen. While great, it still hadn't reached that level that I was hoping for. It hadn't quite got me to a place where I was just in awe as I turned from page to page. I was waiting for it to rock me back in my seat, truly affected by what I had read, but it just hadn't come yet. I knew it was somewhere. As you make your way through each part, it is almost irrefutable that the writing, pacing, paneling, and art continues to improve. You know that this is eventually going to reach new heights, but as I started part 7 with some fading hope of getting that final piece of satisfaction, maybe this isn't for me, I thought. After all, I've given JoJo's dozens of volumes of tries, and it still hasn't hit me in the way that I was expecting a series to do this late into its cycle. As I turned to the final panels of part 7, I finally got it. A new deep impression sat with me as I saw the story coming to an end. I felt myself changed in some way, definitely for the better, but in this sheer state of awe as I read the ending of Steel Ball Run. If you've read this story, you already know. You get it, right? There are very, very few dissenters that I've seen who argue against this part. I've seen many refer to it as Araki's magnum opus, and I find myself in that camp. If you haven't read Steel Ball Run, consider this my message directly to you, the person who felt the same way that I used to. If you've been waiting for a narrative itch to be scratched, Steel Ball Run is required reading. As a small heads up, if you're not caught up, to talk about why Steel Ball Run is so impactful, I need to talk about a bit of a spoiler for the end of part 6, Stone Ocean. So if you're wanting to avoid that, I'd go ahead and read through it or watch through it and come back to this video. I personally don't see it as anything that ruins part 6 by any means, but it is a large enough event in the canon that it is worth giving a spoiler for. I can imagine that as Araki was planning out the final stages of Stone Ocean, he found himself saying what he needed to say as an author about the world that we had come to familiarize ourselves with over the past 17 years. When an author has been in a setting for long enough, there's only so much to tell. One can only create so many stories and express so many feelings in the same setting. In fact, in the last volume of Stone Ocean, Araki is quoted as saying, "I felt like I had reached the peak of my creativity. As an author, I had drawn everything my capabilities allowed." When an author hits this sort of wall, after they have extended themselves to their creative limits, there has to be an opportunity to reset themselves as storytellers. After 17 years of telling the story of the Joestar family lineage, Araki had told the story that he wanted. He had reached a peace with this world after the end of part 6, so in turn, we see in those final panels that the universe itself resets, and the reader discovers a world without the influence of those who wish to do the Joestar family harm. The book end of this story came to a conclusion. So what does that leave the readers with as the author goes on to pursue new ideas and settings? Are we simply to accept the author's ending to a story, to the franchise that we know and love? In 1893, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the ending to his most famous character, Sherlock Holmes, in a story called The Final Problem. In this story, Sherlock and his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, fall to their deaths. Doyle saw Sherlock as this stale idea, hackwork, something that is beneath his talents, and he preferred to write other stories that challenged him creatively. But after a public outcry begging him to bring back the fan favorite, he reluctantly agreed, and in the next book, revived the famous detective in a miracle resurrection. While this same scenario didn't exactly happen to Araki, you can see that the fan base of JoJo's is divided still to this very day about the ending of the JoJo's universe in part 6, with some arguing that this invalidates the stories of the past, and that the characters that we've known to love and cherish over the years were erased in canon, and in turn, their existence became useless. If the ending of this world is just a reset so that these events didn't happen, what was the point of experiencing them? After reading Steel Ball Run, it's clear to me that Araki didn't erase the past, he simply refined it. I'd argue that the experiences that we had with parts 1 through 6 matter even more because we experienced them and we grew close to them. The ending of part 6 doesn't invalidate those experiences, it simply brings out these feelings of love and anguish at their passing, and it heightens the emotions that we feel for the world that he created. And now that Araki had said his piece with that world, what was next for him as an author? With these feelings in mind, Araki clearly uses the past to influence and drive the future. He has this fresh start, free of the influence of immortal vampires, stone men, and stand arrows stashed across the world, and the canon that he had written himself into. Being free to start anew is something that many authors would cherish after spending nearly 2 decades in the same space. With Steel Ball Run, Araki is able to open up an entirely new bag of ideas, along with honing the ideas that made the past arcs so great. With a new story and universe at his fingertips, he is able to write freely for the first time in many years, while still honoring the stories of the past. With these nods to the other parts of JoJo, Araki writes Part 7 and reaches a new height to his creativity, focus, and narrative expression. As you make your way through Part 7, you get this feeling of JoJo's finally being able to fully express itself in a way that it needed to creatively. The art is more vibrant, the paneling is more dynamic, the characters are deeper and more fleshed out, and the depths of the characters, their emotions, and the philosophies that drive them are stronger than they've ever been. This is partly due that when publishing Steel Ball Run, JoJo's was moved from Weekly Shonen Jump, where it had called home since 1987, to the monthly Ultra Jump magazine. As a result of this, while Weekly Shonen Jump was more geared towards school-aged boys with weekly chapter releases of around 20 pages, Araki found himself in the publication of a seinen magazine with Ultra Jump, a monthly magazine that was instead geared more towards young adults and comprised of chapters of anywhere from 30 to 50 pages. When you make your way from chapter to chapter, you start to see that Araki is really utilizing the extra time and space in the chapters to flesh out every landscape, the small movements of the characters, and simply taking more time throughout every chapter for the characters to really express themselves in a way that just simply wasn't able to happen in the confines of a shorter release. If you were to take these longer Ultra Jump chapters and stop them at the midway points of each to match where the chapters would have normally ended in Weekly Shonen Jump, the brilliance and shine of the chapter is stripped away, instead resulting in egregious stoppages of the narrative flow. With Araki able to utilize all the extra space and time, that leads to a story of epic proportions. Part 7 leans into what made the past parts of JoJo great in a lot of ways, but Araki goes out of his way to make sure that these longer chapters tell the most cohesive narrative of any of his stories to date. Steel Ball Run opens with a transcontinental horseback race called, well, the Steel Ball Run, fittingly, pitting all of the world's greatest jockeys, lowlives, honorable lawmen, and everything in between for a race of tens of millions of dollars in prizes. The treacherous adventure from the coast of San Diego to the island of Manhattan puts the characters in every imaginable setting that Araki wishes to utilize. Along with this, because of the literal distance of the race clocking in at around 6,000 kilometers, Araki is able to give himself a very wide berth of putting these characters in a perfect place to watch them evolve and grow through the fights and challenges that make JoJo's unique. The best way that he does this is by rediscovering and redefining the powers of old JoJo parts, putting a new coat of paint on them, and pushing the abilities to new and unforeseen possibilities. In Part 4, Koichi has a stand called Echoes, where in the beginning stages of its abilities, it's able to label items with words, changing the way that they interact with the world. Writing whoosh creates a gust of wind that blows objects away. Boing makes objects elastic and bouncy. In Part 7, Araki expands on this idea to push the idea of words and phrases to a new level. With the introduction of Sandman, we see his stand, called In a Silent Way, take this ability and transform it into its own unique power, while still acting as a homage to the past. The sounds can now act as traps, with the sounds of burning and cutting affecting those who ever touch the objects, inflicting harm on them. The word whoosh can appear in front of him, directing projectiles away from him. The reason I mention this brief example isn't because I want to give a detailed breakdown of each callback to the past JoJo parts and explain why Part 7's version of them is better than their previous parts. but instead it's to show how Araki takes what he's done in the past and how he now refines it to new and exciting possibilities. Even when you see something that seems like a rehash of a previous part, you're going in to experience something new and exciting. And aside from the powers, the characters of Steel Ball Run are on a whole new level. The levels of depth given to each character is much more intense than what you've come to expect out of JoJo's at this point. The main characters of this story, Johnny Joestar and Gyro Zappelli, and the villain of this arc, the character that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Funny Valentine, are, without any shadow of a doubt, the most interesting and complex that Araki has put to paper at this point. With elements of struggles that rattle them to their core, they each have this unique perspective, motivation, and approach to this cross-country race. Whether it be for personal healing, to save an innocent boy, or to protect his country from all forms of harm, it is so clear that while reading, Araki pulled out all of the gap stops to make sure that you deeply enjoy the performances on display. The dynamic between each character, given their pasts, results in a type of richness in the narrative that is just addicting to read. Johnny Joestar was raised in the life of horse racing, with every aspect of his life pointing him towards success as a jockey, being hailed as a genius by all. With these victories at races, he was showered with riches, influence of those in the upper crusts of society, and lust. He, in turn, became a spiteful person, stepping on those lower than him, bullying with the status he gained, getting away with it for years. The environment that he was rewarded in created this type of person. But it wasn't until the universe took this away with him with a bullet to the spine, causing him to become bound to a wheelchair. Now alone, with all of his former connections only tied to him because of his skill as a jockey, he becomes depressed and hopeless until Gyro Zappelli enters into his life. Gyro shows Johnny the power of the spin, and for the briefest of moments, Johnny can stand for the first time in years and becomes drawn to learning more about this power. He wants to walk again, he's desperate to learn more, and in turn joins Gyro in the race for the Steel Ball Run to stay at his side to learn more about this power. And the reason why all of this is interesting to me is that Johnny is far from a selfless character. This entire race means little to him until later on in the story. His attitude and motivations are still very much driven by his own direct gain. But it's not a bad reason to be selfish. In fact, I think many people could empathize with the idea that if they were in the same situation, and if there was a cure to our paralysis, we would chase after it. But he is not the Jonathan Joestar of old, who seemed to be born a good and wholehearted soul. The dynamic between the old JoJo and this JoJo causes us to realize that we are, in some way, rooting for a flawed hero. This is not someone who acts selfless in the face of danger. Johnny doesn't strike you as someone to be the knight on a white horse who holds chivalry and good deeds above all else. And throughout the story, we see him act in ways that are morally questionable or downright wrong to get what he wants. Is this the kind of person to root for? Gyro Zappelli, on the other hand, was raised in a family of executioners. While he carried on his duty for his family and country, he was taught to abandon his sentimentality and instead be the blade and justice for the Kingdom of Naples. As he gets older, he starts to question these beliefs with the injustice placed upon a child who is falsely accused of treason and sentenced to death by Gyro's hand. With his spirit and morality driving him away from his duties, he instead enters the Steel Ball Run to gain amnesty for this little boy. His entire journey through the Steel Ball Run requires that he regain and utilize this sentimentality that he was told to abandon so many years ago. His entire journey is a rediscovery of that sentimentality. When we meet him, Gyro is much more of the archetypal heroic type of character versus someone like Johnny, but as we learn more about his past, the issue with Gyro is that He lacks a type of hunger and drive that only comes from a desperation of one's predicaments. This causes him to fail over and over again, and you start to realize that you're rooting for a character who hasn't won, and maybe he isn't able to win. These two characters come into opposition to Funny Valentine, the man who wants to hold the napkin. Valentine, I would argue, has the most altruistic goals of anyone in the story from the standpoint of raising the overall benevolence of those in the United States, those that he took an oath to protect and help prosper. No one in the story would help more people than Valentine if he were to have his way. Through being the leader and making the choices, through wanting it all to follow him and his actions, he can use his abilities to protect the United States from harm, to show that ultimate expression of love that he had instilled in him so long ago with the memories and influence of his father. While the rest of the world may suffer for it, Valentine sees himself as the one in society who is able to bear the brunt of the stress and pressure of making that choice. And with his job as the President of the United States, that's what you would expect someone to do in his position. Is it not the job of the president to keep the interests and protection of the country at the forefront? He is, at his deepest level, the most reasonable villain in JoJo's history. He is simply expressing the virtues that he learned while young by giving the country his undying patriotic love. As a side note, to be clear, he's still a villain. He's still a very bad person. Valentine does objectively evil things throughout the story to help reach this goal. And you'll see a meme online that says Valentine did nothing wrong, but it is simply a meme. If people truly feel that way after reading, I would recommend putting an infinite amount of space between you and that person. But the players in this story all collide in a way that has never been seen before in JoJo. The action and fight scenes are more dynamic, the characters and symbolisms are deeper, and the ways that these characters interact and react against each other are still among the best in Araki's catalog. So if you came across this video with the same mindset that I had, yeah, it's a great series, but it's nothing special. If you had that attitude towards JoJo, you owe it to yourself to sit down and read through this great work. But I'd encourage you to really push yourself to the end, even if you don't think you like it. I'd gotten about 30 chapters in through part 7 and was about to put it down. I was still burdened by that old outlook of it's just really good, but it's not great. But once the ball, not the steel kind, starts to roll, it doesn't stop. And when I got through the halfway point of the series, I just couldn't put it down. I can finally say that JoJo's left me in awe, and I hope that it does the same for you. Thank you so much for watching. With the 4th of July coming upon us, how could I not talk about the most American and patriotic JoJo's part? I really appreciate you sticking around to the end. It really helps out the channel, and it helps me stay motivated to make new videos every month for you. If you have a suggestion for the next video, please leave it below. I'm always looking for new ideas, so if it's a breakdown of a series, of a style or aspect of writing, or just something more on the casual side with a quicker style of video on a smaller topic, be sure to make a comment. If you liked the video, like the video. If you disliked the video, dislike the video. But if you'd like to see more from me in the future, and perhaps even covering a topic that you suggest, make sure that you subscribe so you can see more of what I have down the pipeline. Thanks again so much for watching. This was how these panels flowed.